ask a lot of questions. Sometimes because you don't know, and sometimes because you're not satisfied with the answer.
Ecology is not just about big landscapes, you know, you can have a microcosm, you can have a microhabitat in the floral head of a grass that actually houses spiders and predators and prey and other things, you know.
Welcome to Cross-Border Conversation, a STIR original video series. The format has been very simple, where we invite two professionals from across the geographical boundaries and varied creative discipline to imbibe into each other's professional journey, talk about the subject of their interest, their lives, their anecdotes, their stories, while we watch them inspire us. Today, there's a twist in the format. Thanks to lockdown, the two professionals happen to cross the border, and we are glad that they're present today in STIR Studio. Therefore, this conversation is not happening anymore in a virtual room, it's happening in reality. I'm so happy to invite, and I'm glad to have Pradip, Krishen, and Feenstra as part of yet another episode of Cross-Border Conversation. Pradip is an environmentalist, a habitat expert, national award-winning filmmaker, teacher, and a tree talker. He taught history at Delhi University for 5 years before joining a 2-bit private TV studio in 1976 to make a short popular science documentaries. He made his first feature film, Message Sahib, in 1984, and 2 more films, in which Annie Gives It Those Ones in 1989 and Electric Moon in 1991. He turned away from cinema in 1994 and got a bit lost, built himself a small home in jungle near Panchmari, and began learning all he could about trees by walking about in the wild and his architect friend, Golak Kandol. It took several years before he published his first book on trees, The Trees of Delhi, in 2006, followed by Jungle Trees of Central India in 2015. His most recent publication is Aba Mahal Bagh, a garden of wild plants from the Thar Desert, 2019. He began rewilding degraded landscapes in a small way in 2002 in the foothills of Uttarakhand, but hit his stride in 2006 when he began creating Rao Jodha Desert Rock Park in Jodhpur in a ruined habitat of volcanic rock. He's worked on 4 rewilding projects in all, the latest one being the creation of Krishen Bagh in Jaipur. Welcome, Pradip. With Pradip, we have Professor Feenstra. Anne is a laureate of Global Award for Sustainable Architecture, 2012 from Paris, a former Dean of Architecture, STEP University, Ahmedabad. He's been teaching at SPA Delhi in Kabul and in Kathmandu. With his teams, he practices a pro-people, pro-ecology, material upcycle, research-based form of architecture. His work for urban processes like Delhi 2050, Mussoorie 2040, and ecological sensitive rural projects all over the Hindu Kush and Himalayas are very well known. He's also a columnist and an editorial advisor for STIR, and we are very happy to have Anne as part of the STIR member. Most interestingly, he tells us his typical clients are Marco Polo sheep in Afghan Pamis, snow leopards in Gangotri, red pandas in Nepalese Tepuljan. Welcome, Anne. Welcome, Anne, and welcome, Pradip. While we watch two gentlemen perfectly attuned to nature and the wild, today's conversation is about one thing: how can design embrace nature, ecology, environment, and how the values of humanity are centered around that. Thank you. Thank you for accepting STIR's invitation to be part of Cross-Border Conversation. While you talk to each other, we watch you inspire us.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd love to hear from you, Anne, about the work you did in Afghanistan, just as a starting off, because I've seen pictures and it looks fascinating. But particularly when you were asked to design something that was situated in a national park, How did you conceptualize it? And how did you think of the appropriateness of what you were creating in that setting? Tell us a little bit about that.
I think first of all, the preconceived idea of a country like Afghanistan, where, you know, when you meet people in Delhi or in Paris and you say, hi, I'm Anne, and so what do you do? I'm teaching in Kabul and I'm doing some projects in Afghanistan. People literally take a step back and say, oh my God, what is...
But there's an assumption it's dangerous, is that it? Or what?
It's who would go to Afghanistan? Or people think it's only about the Osama bin Ladens and about Kalashnikovs and about suicide bombers and things like that. But I think they forget that 2 centuries ago, it was on the crossroads of civilization. The idea of that Afghanistan is today what it is, it's a very old country. It's a very old cradle of civilization. So Bandi Amir, at 3,000 meter altitude, highly calcareous water, pH value is about 8.1. Amazing sediment stone, which as architects we call a travertin, cascading from one lake into the other. There's 6 beautiful lakes in a stunningly kind of this kind of color of blue, because it's so calcareous. It kind of, you put a stick in the water, after an hour it's white. So that means you have special plants, you have special aquatic life in that area. And what do you do as an architect? I take my time to see what is the project, what is the land, what are the people there, etc., etc. So first I start with observations, and then you say, well, you know, you start coming up with possible ideas. So one of the things I was very clear about, because the first time I arrived at it's called Bandi Haibat, which is kind of the lake where you enter the national park. They told me, yeah, they used to fish with dynamite here. So that's very efficient. You throw in the dynamite and kaboom, the fish starts flowing up. And they washed, I saw people driving up to the lake, changing their motor oil in the lake and washing their cars. And it's so painful to see that. So the first thing we did was not to design a building, but how to prevent people of making an environmental disaster. The second thing that I did, and I was very fortunate that there was a female governor called Habiba Sarobi, the only female governor that Afghanistan has had, educated in India as a doctor, fantastic lady who was basically the Bamiyan governor. And if you work on a national park, you have many, many people involved.
How large is this area, the national park? I mean,
well, the area that was the hunting ground was 70 square kilometers, and we've been able to manage to include all the watersheds, so it became 10 times the size. Yeah, so 700 square kilometers. But for Habiba Sarobi and the discussions, etc., she's very good with people. Maybe it is she's a natural, maybe it is because she's a doctor, maybe whatever, but and I like to work with people. So there are 4 villages around these lakes, and we kept on talking about how can we include these villages in the national park. Because once it becomes a national park, it means you cannot do this, you cannot do this, this is not possible anymore. If you do this, we give you a penalty. If you do that, we throw you in jail.
We know that restrictive regime well here. Yeah.
Do not list is endless, and local people will say, well, we've been living here for many generations. What's in it for us? So one thing was the people who know that area best is the local people. So we came up with the idea of rangers and nature guides. That, you know, it's jobs. Everybody likes a job. In that area, there's also, I would say, serious unemployment, hidden unemployment. But it's good to have a job. So if the national park can lead to more jobs for local people, that's a good start. The client in this case was the clients, of course, were the sheep and the deer and the fish and things like that. But the person who picked up the bill was the Asian Development Bank. And for them, this is kind of a minuscule project, because Asian Development Bank, they do, I don't know, mega hydro dam of I don't know, $400 million, or a highway from A to B of $200 million. So I kind of start to spend time with people there and see how they live. There's no hotels, so ultimately you end up with families staying there. You make your observations, and then the rivers that used to be there, I mean, millions of years ago, were humongous, were huge. So the same, actually, it's interesting. So the sediment stones that you have, that's also in Afghanistan. So once upon a time, this was a massive kind of river. So it starts as a glacier, then it becomes a kind of and then it becomes a river, etc. So it's eroded. So we look at it as a kind of stone, but actually it's a section. And these horizontal lines in the landscape, on the rocks, in the around the lakes, absolutely fascinating.
Bedding marks.
Yes. So now at this moment in time, and the river has gone down to a trickle. It's much smaller, but these rocks are there.
And the reason why the rivers have disappeared is climate change, or is something else?
I don't know. I'm not. I don't have that knowledge. Yeah. But the idea that you have a changing landscape over thousands of years, and that at this moment in time, you as an architect are asked to make an intervention in that amazing landscape. It was very clear for me that the buildings that we would design would need to be all-sided, because the beauty is everywhere. So it's not a classical building where you have a front facade, or what they sometimes teach you at the schools of architecture. You have a front elevation and a side elevation and a back elevation.
And a little setback from something.
Everything is the front. There is no back. The other thing, because it's 3,000 meter altitude, temperatures drop down to minus 20 degrees. There's a serious amount of snowfall in the winter. So these buildings better be comfortable. And I saw that they use a lot of sun-dried bricks in that area. So the design that we kind of came up with is a combination of sun-dried brick walls, 80 centimeters thick, nothing wrong with a thick wall, double glazing orientated towards the morning sun. I mean, we call that passive solar energy. And then we inserted these kind of local flat stones in the mud wall, because it's an earthquake-prone area, and if you have, an earthquake of, let's say 4.5 or 5.5 or even 6, with building an earthquake-resistant kind of building, you can handle that. If there is a 7.5 or 8 on the scale of Richter, there's nothing you can do. So that became the language, which is great, because it means that these sun-dried bricks, they're made on site. It's literally local. So we tested it out if it had enough clay. You fill your form, you flip it around, the next day you turn it around, and after 3 days you have a beautiful sun-dried brick. And people know how to work with it. They understand the skills and the technique.
Their homes are built with the same materials.
Yeah. Only they don't use double glazing. They don't use passive solar energy. So I think the idea of, for me at least, see if you work in that area, can you design something where you actually have a lot of people involved, local people involved? Because that creates ownership. If you are the guy who made that wall, or you are the guy who did the timber work of that building, you on a Friday, in Afghanistan it's Juma, it's the Friday. You go around with your kids and say, "That's Daddy did this," huh? Or, yeah. So I think the idea of architecture being something fancy or quick or whatever, I understand that. I've seen it. I worked a few years in London, etc., etc. But I don't believe it lasts very long. If people look at the photograph of a building and they say, well, where is the building? For me, that's a compliment. Yeah. Huh? But I think the joy of making something together and then it's their home base. With Habiba Sarobi, we were able to convince the Asian Development Bank that this would not only be for the national park, not only a visitor center, but it would also be for community meetings. So the community literally have a key of that building. If they have a meeting in the winter, that's where they have the meeting. Yeah. And people are people. If they see, in the beginning, I was scolded by the Afghans because they said, hey, don't you see, there's already glass. Why do you put a second piece of glass? It's a waste. And I said, well, in between that glass you have still standing air, and etc., etc. How do you explain to Afghans in the middle of the Hazarayat the conceptual idea of double glazing? And they thought there was a trick. What's the trick? I said the trick is the still standing air. It's nothing. So how can that work? But if they see in the first winter that building is really comfortable, if you go back today, they use double glazing for their own houses.
Oh really?
Yeah.
They've taken to it. Yeah.
Because people are people. If you see that something works, you've been part of the making yourself. You adopt it.
I want to try and understand from you, Anne, how you tried to understand the landscape. The landscape for me, I find that in this country, if you talk to foresters, you talk to the forest department in Rajasthan, for example, and there are some landscapes I love. I travel a lot in the desert. But you talk to them and there's a kind of opaqueness. They're not interested in landscapes. They don't see the beauty, they don't see the geology, they don't appreciate it. I've benefited a lot by talking to a friend of mine called Dr. Pranay Lal, who's written this wonderful book called Indica. I don't know whether you've seen Indica, but he in some sense was key to my to opening my eyes to geology, really, and to being able to distinguish things, But I'm just wondering, when you first went to this part of Afghanistan and you were faced with this amazing landscape that was so forbidding and it sounds amazing, how did you begin to familiarize yourself with what you were and teach yourself what you were looking at? And how much did you feel the need to do that?
Actually quite a lot, because it's from Bamiyan you drive about 2.5 hours to the west, and then at a certain moment in that rocky, arid kind of landscape with the yellows and the rosettes colors, bang, there are these blue lakes. And then when you get out of the car and you walk a few meters, you smell the herbs of that barren landscape. So it's kind of, it's I think the word is modesty. If you have the guts to intervene in a landscape like that, I think it's very important to be modest and to kind of, to my students I sometimes say, why do you think that we have one nose and one mouth and two ears? Huh? And then especially when they're first or second year students, they kind of, oh, we don't know, sir. And I said, because it's very important apparently that we can listen. And architects in general, or designers, are not very good in listening. And listening is of course observation and smelling and the senses and those kinds of things. So if you design a building where you know it's going to be damn cold in the, October onwards, and you know that 3 of these rangers will actually stay in that visitor center, why not use the heat that you use for your cup of tea or to make the soup, the warm air? Why should it go out to the atmosphere? Why not use a channel in kind of an onion shape, because air needs to have flow, and then a chimney inside the building, and all that warmth actually goes into the building. I learned it from them. It's just that you need time to see it, you need time to question, you need time to understand. I ask a lot of questions, yeah. Sometimes because you don't know, and sometimes because you're not satisfied with the answer. Or you know that there might be, if you ask this question to another person, you get a different answer. So the ultimate, whatever truth, I don't think it exists, but you try to kind of put things together and base yourself on some research, some questioning, some observations, and then see, this could work.
So with the work that I do, on for example, when I first went to Jodhpur and was confronted with this volcanic rock landscape, I knew nothing about the desert. I knew nothing about the rock. And you didn't really have any source of information about what an original the original plant that lived in this landscape would have been like. Yep. So in fact, when I was first taken there, I saw a landscape that was completely dominated by this invasive plant that we call Vilaiti kikar here, which is the Prosopis juliflora. And the person who had invited me to come there and work on it said, will you, all he said was, will you green this landscape for us? And I said, what exactly do you mean by greening this landscape? And this is a landscape that is right bang next to the iconic Mehrangarh fort. Yeah. And it was clear that they wanted a kind of pleasant adjunct to the fort, right? It was almost like a, make it neater and nicer, a little park. And I said, look, if in your mind's eye, if you have a notion that you want, green lawns and places where people can sit on park benches under, flowering trees, first of all, we'll have to bring in literally several million tons of soil into and fill it up. Yeah. And then you're going to have to water everything, every single plant and every single blade of grass for every day for the rest of your lives, because we are in a desert that has very little water. And then he said, well, when you put it that way, then maybe we don't want that. What are the options? And I said, look, what we can try and do, and I don't have the experience, but what we can try and do is to restore the natural ecology of volcanic rock. And he said, how would we do that? I said, well, we do that by going out into the desert and finding places that resemble our place. Something like, I didn't know it then, but the statistic is that something like 14 or 15% of the Thar Desert is rocky and the rest is all sandy, right? But underneath there's a lot of rock. And you have a rhyolitic, a volcanic province that is 500,000 square kilometers under the sand, right? and in places it outcrops. So there are some places where you can see it. In other places, basically the volcanic rock was covered by sandstone, which formed in shallow seas roughly 50 million years ago. Yeah. And I said, look, it's a matter of going out and understanding by looking and collecting seeds from plants that grow there and bringing them in. And he was understandably skeptical. Yeah. He couldn't sort of picture what this might mean. He was probably thinking of these very forbidding kind of rocky places, you know. And he was also obviously, I think, a little concerned about the fact that I was no expert. Yeah. And you see, the big problem for people like me working in a plant world anywhere in India is that there is no information about the ecology of plants. There are you know, books about that list all the plants, but there is very little information about what the plants need in terms of either the minerals or the soil or the water regime or climate. So all of that you actually have to learn by trial and error. But there's nothing like looking, and this is what connects it to what you were saying, that you actually had to learn to look very deeply in order to try and understand what is happening. And you had to keep records, and you had to systematize those records. So, for example, when we first started, well, first we had to remove all the precipice, the invasive stuff. And when we started planting up the habitat, we were getting, you know, 60-70% survival rates, which were not, we didn't quite know why we were not getting bigger survival rates. And then what we did was that every single pit that actually contained a plant, we said, let's number them, let's measure the depth of each pit. We were trying 2 or 3 different kinds of planting soil mixes. We were using mycorrhiza and propagules in some and not in others. And let's record the species that is being put into each pit. And let's also make a note about the site quality where each pit is. Yep. And let's see whether we can make any sense of this. Yep. And we didn't always make sense of it, but if you do this on an Excel sheet and then you arrange it in such a way that it comes to you species-wise and not pit number-wise, you sometimes begin to see patterns. Yes. That, you know, a particular tree or a particular bush, if you have a pit that is less than 3 feet deep, it's not going to survive. Or if it's slightly higher up away from, you know, the bottom of a rock, it's not going to survive. So you really had to learn the hard way. And then we started having fantastic, you know, survival rates. And so it's only when we either had a dog digging up or a plant or a hare, you know, nibbling at a plant that we had casualties. But this business of looking and understanding in the desert, you know, it started when we began the project. It's already 15 or 16 years ago. And I continue to do it. I continue to learn. There's so much that, you know, it's like a great big sponge, and then you have to just literally extract it bit by bit. It's only now that I'm beginning to really enjoy the geology of the desert, because I've had help from one friend who allows me to see. But it's a huge problem in this country, Ane, that foresters are blind to landscapes, you know. We are losing landscapes. I mean, for example, you know, you drive out from Jaipur towards Jodhpur and you come to some of these incredible granitic landscapes. And granite, as you must know, forms underground. It's basically magma that is cooled underground and has this very large crystal lattice structure. But when it gets exposed, you start getting these amazing swirls and shapes that are basically, you know, forms of erosion by water, and they're beautiful. They're beautiful, and people will actually tell you that, you know, have you seen the owl in Sendra? There's one huge owl that you see at the top, you know, when you're driving it. But all of these landscapes are going. You know, they're going because there is no form of protection. There's no form of any kind of controls, because they're not recognized as being beautiful. So I've actually lectured at the Forest Training Institute in Jaipur, where I literally was just only showing them landscapes in order to say, look, isn't this beautiful? And they would be looking at this and saying, how this is in so-and-so place. But it was a kind of dismissal, you know, of the importance of these things.
This process of observations and listening and looking and taking notes, taking pictures, pondering about it, thinking about it, testing it out, etc. Do you involve the accumulated wisdom of people who know about it? Because if you can use the wisdom of them and their knowledge of the land, of the trees, of the flora, of the fauna, and those kind of things, well, the chances that you will be more successful is more. How much in your projects do you involve?
Well, it varies. So in Jaipur, for example, where we've created the Kishan Bagh in the city, you know, in a duney kind of landscape.
Yes. We edge of the city, yeah?
It's not even the edge, it's actually in the city. It's sort of, there's settlements and habitation even beyond us. Yeah. But we went into the desert to say, look, we want all our civil structures there, which are mostly gazebo-like structures. They're not really places with walls and things like that. To evoke the vernacular architecture of the Thar. And we learned so much about, the materials they use and how they use them. And they're absolutely beautiful, and they're practical, and they're just wonderful. But in Jodhpur, where we were exploring, plants in rocky habitats, the first huge learning we had was actually contacting a community of traditional miners who we came to after, the big problem for us was, how are we going to get rid of this invasive tree? Because one thing that we learned very early on was that this tree has a budding zone that goes down 2.5 feet. So if you cut anywhere before 2.5 feet below the surface, it'll just coppice and come up again. And you can do that in sand, and you can do that in mud, you can do that in, in soil, but this is really hard, crystalline, even harder than granite, right? And all kinds of solutions were proposed to us, including using compressor-driven, drills, using dynamite. People even said, use dynamite, and we said, and of course there are toxic solutions that people reach for very easily, and there was no question of using any kind of chemical thing. And just when we were beginning to despair, somebody said, why don't you try the local community of miners? They're called Khandwalias, and they're brilliant because they have a real understanding of how rock works. And I was skeptical, quite frankly, on it to begin with, because the building stone, the dimensional stone that is used in Jodhpur, even in preference to, to brick and anything else, is a sandstone. Yeah. Which is a very obedient stone. It's a stone that you can, it'll do whatever you want it to do. Yeah. Whereas rhyolite is a very disobedient stone. You try and take your chisel to it, and it'll cut in completely unpredictable ways and break in unpredictable ways. So they have very little occasion to actually work with rhyolite. So anyway, we called in a man called Dhan Singh, who was the leader of one of the little communities of Khandwalias there. And we knew that they had actually, in Mehrangarh Fort, there's a shaft that is 12 stories high for the lift in solid sandstone rock. And they actually, about 22 years ago, ancestors or maybe even uncles of these Khandwalias had actually chiseled down 12 stores, a vertical shaft, so that it could actually take a lift to take people up to the top of the fort. So we asked Dhan Singh, we showed him a bush that was maybe 4 feet high, and we said, can you dig down a minimum of 3 feet so that we are sure that it's not going to coppice again? And he looked at it and he said, sure, easy, And we said, okay, show us, and they used these extremely heavy heads on their hammers that probably weigh about 4 kilos. And they used chisels. And he sat down and he tapped the rock around the bush lightly, and then he turned his face away and he hit it hard, two or three times, just the ground. But I thought he was moving his head away so that, if there was a chip of rock or a shard of rock, it wouldn't go into his eyes. I mean, that's what you would assume, right? Yeah. But later we didn't realize it at the time, but later we realized that what he's actually doing is he's listening. to the sound of his hammer on the rock, and from that sound he gains all the information that he needs about how it's bedded, how it's interbedded, where it might be hollow, you know, everything that he needs to know before he starts cutting in. And we came back 2 hours, 2.5 hours later, and he was beginning to pull out these flat ribbon roots, which is one of the, tactics that the precipice was using to actually succeed in this, in the cracks between rocks, which was amazing. But we knew then that this was the only, eco-friendly solution that we had to remove what was, in effect, thousands and thousands of precipice trees. And it took us 7 years. It took us 7 years working with a team of 15 guys. But their skill, not just with cutting into rock, but even, you give them a boulder this big, and they will use what they call, crowbars, what they call lagias, and they'll make it walk, in a way that is just stunningly, amazing. So their skill is amazing. But with regard to the plants, when we talked to local people, while they knew everything, they knew the name, they knew what medicinal value it had, they didn't necessarily know, because they weren't interested in how to grow them. And we were primarily interested in how to grow them and how to tend them. So that was one area where we didn't profit from local knowledge, right?
There is this little part, if you look at the map of Afghanistan, this part is kind of jutting down to China, and then Pakistan on the southern side, and then Tajikistan on the north. In that, what they call the Wahan Corridor, that is a place where you have a lot of snow leopards and Marco Polo sheep and the black bear and all these apex kind of species. We ended up going to the Wahan Corridor, where the Pamir and the Wahan River come together. There's a place called Kala-i-Panja. There's kind of 5 rivers, Panj, come together, and the Kala is the Kila, the fort. And that was supposed to be the place where we would make the kind of visitor center, etc., for the second national park. My wife Anahita came along, and we both like stones, and we walked through the riverbed, and we looked at the glaciers, and had local soup with the people, etc., etc. And then in the design of the building, we had 2 columns that were supposed to hold up the roof, where you had the sun-facing facade. And then to go from the column to the beam, we had a kind of, the idea was to make a big piece of stone as a capital.
Like a capital, yeah.
So the columns are from timber, the 4 biggest pieces of timber we could find. We all bolted it together and we scooped it out on the top, and then we needed to find the stone. I had spoken to the local people. I spoke a little bit of Dari, the language in Afghanistan, but when you go to that place they speak Wahi, the Wahan language. So anyway, if you want to communicate with people, you can. You either draw it or you sketch it, or there's always somebody who to get it going. And they said, well, it's going to be this mason can find us the stones and things like that. And then somebody said, why don't you ask the guy who's making millstones? And I said, yeah, is there an example? So he took me to a house, and behind the house there's a little stream, and there are 2, serious, I would say a meter in diameter, grinding stones for the wheat.
Made of granite or what?
Of granite, yeah. And you see that happening, and of course, right, you need a hole in the middle. And I thought, wow, if you can make these stones, the capital is an easy one. So we found a guy in the next village, and we invited him to come over and basically go into the riverbed and select the 2 capital stones. Almost a similar story as you, where I mean, yes, I'm slow architecture, but following this guy in the riverbed, at a certain moment, I see a good stone, and I see another good stone, and I see a third good stone, and I said, should we can't be bothered with it, yeah? Because he knows. I think, but he knows. And then at a certain moment, and I said, what about this one? And I thought, that looks really good. And he took his little hammer out. Tuck, 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 tuck. And as you, it's not working. Has an internal crack or something like that. Ultimately, end of the day, we found these two stones, and he kind of, whatever. So if you go there, there's this kind of thing. But this is such an important lesson in basically humility, because as an architect, in architecture schools, etc., you only see the Frank Gehry's and the Zaha Hadid's and the Rem Koolhaas's, and you're supposed to become a star architect, right? Like a movie star or kind of a pop music star. And actually, what you learn from a fellow like that, who has been making millstones for 25 years, that is real knowledge. So be modest, be very happy to be a little bit humiliated and be a little bit down on the ground, etc. And just listen to somebody who knows much more about things than you do. And I think this is the problem sometimes with the forest department.
No, actually, Anne, we do have a Germanic system in this country.
You do?
Yeah.
Okay.
When the British wanted to begin scientific forestry,
Yeah.
in the late 1850s, soon after the Crown had taken over from the East India Company, and they were extending their domain, the British didn't have a system of scientific forestry in Britain at that time. They had no schools, they had none of that. The French did, and the Germans did. And you wouldn't catch the British going to the French and saying, give us some foresters. So they went to the Germans. And the first Inspector General of Forest was a man called Dietrich Brandis, who first went to Burma, familiarized himself there with Burmese dry deciduous forests, came over, became Inspector General here, and the entire system of forestry was controlled and devised by him and by Ribbentrop and by a series of German names, lasting for, I mean, the Germans were the heads, the Inspector Generals for about 30 years when we started forestry. And the concept of what in English is called the high forest was theirs. What they did here was, basically they said, look, you know, I mean, the area I know best is central India, right? Which is a huge, I mean, the area that I was looking at is about as big as France. And what happened in central India was that basically you have these amazing mixed deciduous forests of great diversity. And the forest department was taught, sweep away all the trees that have no direct economic use to human beings. I have a friend of mine who is in the forest department. He said, you know, when we learned how to mark trees for felling, we were told, jahan bhi dhoban dikhega, usko mark kar lo. Wherever you see a dhoban tree, just put a green mark on it for felling. And he said the reason was that dhoban is actually a dalbergia, which is one of the rosewoods, which are very valuable woods. But this particular species develops little bands of weak cells in unpredictable places. So if you take a plank like this and you sit on it, it may suddenly break. Therefore, useless tree, can't make planks, cut it. Even though this is a tree that is, you know, it's a leguminous tree, it's a nitrogen fixer.
When you say cut the tree, the thunder is starting.
That's right. So the whole system of forestry was based on, is this tree useful to man or not? And anything that is not has to be swept away. And when I started traveling in central India for my book to explore, I was doing this, you know, around 2000. I started in 2010. I'm looking at old books written towards the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century, and they're talking about particular forest patches and reserved forests, and they sound wonderful. I go there, and there's nothing left except a little monoculture of teak, because the whole thing has been converted to a Germanic idea of a forest. And I read another very interesting statistic which will interest you. Somebody said that in Germany today, 90% of their forests consist of 7 species. Only 7 species, of which 3 are exotic. There's a Norway pine, and there's a something spruce, and there's a Scots pine. But I mean, that is their idea of forestry, and it's to my mind, it's a devastating idea, you know. And the sad thing is that we still follow many of these ideas. The Forest Corporation, which is a branch of the Forest Department, continues to think like that. The sad fact is that if you start counting what are the trees that we actually use in our cities and in our parks and on our avenues, it's about 50 or 60 species. And that's to my mind, a really telling remark about how, as a civilization, we don't seem to be interested in what's out there. It's just whatever the nurseries provide, or whatever. And the Forest Department is not interested. There is not a single forest department in any part of this country that has a reasonable representation of the native trees of that region growing inside a nursery. They only grow what they think is in demand, and that is just the usual suspects, you know, the 50 or 60 species.
This is the Ramganga river map.
Right.
I don't have anyone to give away, but we were asked to make basically a map of the riverscape, which is half in Corbett, this part, Hisdikala, and half outside. And the idea was to show the richness of biodiversity outside Corbett Park. Because nature doesn't stop where we kind of make a boundary line. So I think the collaborations that we had with the Forest Department people, there's a person called Rajiv Batri, IFS officer, etc., etc. So sometimes you get very lucky if you can work together with basically, you know, they're as educated, as smart, as concerned as we are. But yes, you also have very much what I would call the harvest kind of attitude, where it is not about ecology, but it is about numbers. And it is about, hey, you're a good forest department officer if from your district, hey, you get the good numbers of harvesting kind of the forest, then you've done a good job. So this is silviculture. This is kind of, it's an industry. Maybe we should organize something. We should maybe organize that we go to FRI, the Forest Research Institute, which is for budding young forest officers, the place of knowledge. They have 6 museums in that pretty impressive building. You've been there?
I know it well, yes.
Yeah.
I feel very depressed when I go there, quite frankly.
Okay.
I feel very, very sad when I see it.
Yeah. And see if I've been able to do that at CEPT University, if we can change something in the curriculum. Because I had a few discussions at CEPT University where the maybe not so good professors, they blame students. They say students, they don't sketch anymore. They don't know how to draw anymore. I want them to draw, etc., etc. Or students are lazy, as a blanket statement. Or students are not interested in this. Or students are, and I kind of say, well, they're young. In general, they go to the university because they want to learn something. So it's also a matter of, are you able to engage and teach and get them enthusiastic and get something, little fire in them going, not a forest fire, but a little fire that makes them kind of, you know, go an extra mile or do in the weekend not, you know, check out something extra. I give you one example. I did a studio combined with landscape teachers In Sept University, landscape and architecture and conservation and theory, it's all under the wings of the dean. And I felt that the gap between landscape architects and landscape architect students and professors and architecture was really big when I came. The architects said, no, these landscape people, with that little flick of the hand, kind of dismissive kind of thing. And the landscape people were kind of saying, no, these architects, they don't take us serious. They see us as a kind of, sort of gardeners who do little plans after the building is finished. And then we are roped in to do a little bit of beautification, and we're not like that, etc. But they don't take us serious. Anyway, task for the dean to bring them together, etc. And I decided not to be a teaching, not to be a administrative or kind of sit in your own room dean, but a teaching dean. So I took a class of second year studio, together with landscape teachers. So architecture and landscape in one studio. And the idea was to go to an island called Kabirwat. Baruch, yeah. So I said to the second year students, I said, I think we need to spend some time on that island, because if your assignment for this semester is that you can create something that is half built and half grown, you need to understand the place, the context, you need to talk to people, you need to see what works, what doesn't work, etc., etc. So some of them said, yeah, but it's pretty long way from Ahmedabad to go there, and this and that. I said, that's right. So I have found out, I had gone there to check out how things are. There's a guest house on the island, and you can stay there overnight. If you bring your own food, you can cook there, etc., etc. So I said, I think it's best that we stay overnight. We go from Ahmedabad, we go to that place, we do our first kind of work, etc. We stay overnight, and then we have another day to kind of really get a feeling for the place. And they said, sir, we're not so sure, because then we have to ask permission of our parents, and this and that and that. And I said, so who wants to go? Nobody. Zero. Zero. So I said, okay guys, now I'm going to talk to you guys. I said, the last boat that you can take from Kabirwat back to the mainland is at 4:30. So I said, if you take the last boat back to 4:30 and you arrive in Ahmedabad and you can have your sweet dal bhat at home, etc., etc., yeah, you have seen something, but you also miss something. Sir, what do we miss? I said, you miss the sunset. To be on an island and to have on different places water and to see the sun sinking in. And then after the sun has set down, and if you walk along the river, you have these little fish that when you walk, they sliver away into the water, etc. And then you have the owls that start flying. Anyway, so I give a whole description of the end of the day on Kabirwat Island.
Very, very evocative and very clever.
And then I said, and now we go to the next morning. So we will wake up before the sun. We will be up and we will see how excited the birds and all the animals get before the sun gets up. And I kind of had a few pictures and things like that. I said, sir, we want to go. We all want to go. I said, good. So it's also, as a teacher, what do you do? Are you afraid of some parents saying, what is this? My daughter is a second year student. She cannot stay overnight at this strange island east of Baruch, etc. Or do you say, what the heck? These kids are, 19, 20 years old. What's the big deal? They're a group. They can cook. So we had a hell of a time. So some people chop the onions, and some you most of the time you end up with a bit of an impromptu meal, but then to take that night walk. So around 9 o'clock I said, so who wants to go for a night walk? Everybody wants to go. But they're scared. They're so scared. Because they're urban kids. They don't know the sounds of...
But isn't it also about learning how to look, you know? I mean...
Yeah, of course, but if so you need to, I think that is one of the jobs of teachers, or of you need to tell them stories, you need to engage them, and ultimately you can read 200 books, but you need to feel it. And if you don't feel it, it will always be something that is imposed, or you did it because of somebody else and those kind of things. So I think, I don't know, you're scared of the FRI. I'm not scared of the FRI. If somehow we can convince, and I have enough contacts in the forest department in Utrecht to cook up something, to get at least a couple of young, I would say good-willing, male, female, future officers to get excited about something like this, to start reading landscapes, to start opening up their senses. Because once they get excited, they start somewhere at a junior position, and then they grow through the ranks. Then, you know, at a certain moment you become, I don't know, Director Corbett, and then you become the PCCF and the CCCF and the WCVF, whatever F. There's always an F there. And as Feenstra, I quite like the F, of course. But I think rather than to kind of say, there's something really wrong with this country, there's something really wrong with the forest department, the system, maybe we can challenge it. And through your books, I'm 100% sure the people who read your books, they will never think in the same way about trees as they did before.
So I'm skeptical. I'd love to do a series of, you know, a whole program with the FRI. But you know, it's bigger than that. It's not just foresters. It's actually landscape architects in this country. It's people who run nurseries. It's the forest department. You're absolutely right, that very important. And what is the fourth one? It's municipal horticulture people, you know. Municipal horticulture. There's this famous line that was once spoken to me by somebody in the Central Public Works Department. He said, I'd taken him to Nehru's Samadhi to identify a tree that I couldn't tell what it was. Yeah. And I said, do you know what this tree is? He was he'd been in charge for 12 years. He said, yeah, this is a Rudraksh tree. So I said, no, it can't be a Rudraksh tree because Rudraksh doesn't have milky latex. This has a milky latex. Look, and I showed him the milky latex. He said, I don't know what milky latex, this is a Rudraksh tree. And he called another Mali to say, Mali, please tell us, what is this tree? So the Mali said, it's a Rudraksh tree. So I said, well, who told you? He said, this gentleman told me. It was very circular, you know. Then he said this immortal line. He said to me, देखो साहब, किसमें दूध है, किसमें दूध नहीं है, I don't know. I don't know which one has milk, which one doesn't. My job is just to do gudai and to do watering. इतने deep में नहीं जाते हम. We don't go so deep into anything. But damn it, it's your job to go deep into these things, you know. We have a useless system of horticulture at the municipal level, at least in this city. You know, it's absolutely pathetic, you know. And in the forest department, there are some brilliant officers. There are some brilliant exceptions, you know. But by and large, you know, it's a very moribund organization. Just like a lot of old institutions that have just ossified. I'm pretty sure that if you were to look at the curriculum that foresters have to, you know, undergo a read in the FRI, probably harks back 50, 60, 70 years or more, you know. So it's very, very disheartening, but any one of these would profit by people like you being able to go in and say, all right, let's teach you how to look, you know. The other day, you know, about a month ago, no, not a month ago, about 6 months ago, I was driving back with 3 friends. One was Golok, my architect friend. Another one is another guy who rewilds like I do. And there's a landscape architect who has worked with us a lot. We were driving back about 250 kilometers through a fairly innocuous stretch of desert. Not even pure desert, it's scrub. Back from Nagaur to Jaipur.
Yeah.
And every single thing that we saw excited us. You know, a bird crossed the road and we would say, what is that? Was that a hawk? Was that this? Was that that? There was a fence made by some villagers because they had a house, and we were looking at the fence to see what it was made of and what had they used and how had they woven it together and what had they done. If we saw a little hill or an Inselberg, we were curious about what rock it was. I mean, every single thing. And I did a similar journey with somebody else who just basically sat in the car and wanted to open their laptop and look at films. And I said, how can you not want to look out of the window? You know? How can you want to just bury your nose in a laptop, you know, with a bloody Hollywood film or a Bollywood film, when you've got, I mean, I can't imagine being anywhere in another country, even if I don't know anything about it, you know. Whether you put me in Namibia or in Bolivia or in China, I will want to look out of the window. I will want to look, you know. So there's a lot to be said, I think, for teaching people how to see things, you know.
Yeah. No, but I mean, I've had interns, architects, and then for the first time they go join for a project, and you walk through a field of rice, and then you ask, so what is growing here? And corn? I mean, so I think there is, if you don't have that curiosity, or you don't have the exposure, or you don't have the, it's just ignorance or innocence, or with young people it's innocence, and then at a certain moment it becomes ignorant. And I think maybe it's our job, and thank you very much, Stir, for this kind of a platform, to see if we can change that a bit.
Pradip, you talked about 4 things: nursery, municipality, landscape architect, and forest department. We talked about forest department and the inefficiency or the lack of knowledge. Both of you one of you comes from an educationist background, an academic background. You come from a filmmaking background, and you in the conversation did talk about how to create interest amongst the younger generation, amongst the design and architecture students, or even art students, or any creative community professionals, to imbibe that knowledge and to imbibe that culture of liking this profession, or understanding the nature, understanding the species of trees, and understanding what the granite and the ecology system is all about. Today, there is very little inspiration or aspiration to learn this. Would you, as an educationist and as a storyteller and as a filmmaker, one of the biggest things could be, instead of trying to knock the forest department's door, but to actually knock the younger audience doors and create an amazing movie or a storytelling. Emotions trump, as I say, emotion trumps logic. If we can pick up these younger generation, today's students or today's young practicing professionals who today don't have that charm to even dwell into this aspect of studies of ecology and what we just talked about in the last many minutes. What if we just imbibe that and probe and coax and make them interested by narrating those stories which you did to your kids when you want to take them to for an off-site visit, and you being an experience documentary and film story and film and maker and a storyteller. Maybe that's what is needed more than anything else.
Yeah, so that's what I try and do, Amit. What I'm concerned with, what I try and do is basically, for me, the parks I've made and the books I've written is my communication to a possible audience out there. I'm now thinking of writing something that is going to be more than a book, but perhaps is also a digital, entity that is all about my excitement at what is actually a very degraded forest in the center of this city, to make them see and to open their eyes and to open their minds and to understand that, that ecology is not just about big landscapes. You can have a microcosm, you can have a microhabitat in the floral head of a grass that actually houses spiders and predators and prey and other things, So that's what I do, and that's, but I can't agree with you more that I think our job is to tell stories, our job is to communicate, our job is to invite people to come and look. That's what I hope Rao Jodha Park in Jodhpur does. When people go for a walk there and they are going around with naturalists and they're understanding things, that's the feedback I get as well from when they write stuff to us.
Nature teaches trust and endurance, and design, for being a good design or a bad design, these two factors are critical. The critical evaluation factor in my mind, or a differentiator between good and bad, which is trust and endurance. And you wrote a beautiful article on, can you design trust or can you trust design?
Yep.
How would you react to this when we say, if that's what nature teaches us, that's what a differentiator in your good architecture or design practice as a practitioner. And therefore, these two factors become critical in not just curriculum, but in your own evaluation of your practice and your being as a professional.
I mean, when you say nature teaches us trust and endurance, I think that's only part of the story. It also teaches us fragility, and it teaches us the interconnectedness of everything. This for me is the huge fact about nature. I sometimes feel that we probably know so little today that we will look back on 2020 and smile 20 years from now and say, we had no understanding in those days of how a forest works, or of how how ignorant we were, Because I'm reading an incredible book called A New History of Life, which is talking about the understanding of paleontology, and they've completely, in the last 12 years, they've completely overturned many of the ideas that people had about how things evolved and how things. I think now at a very, very tiny microscopic level, with microbes, with mycorrhiza, with fungal networks, we are beginning to understand plants also in a completely different way. We are being able to inject little sort of dyes, radioactive dyes into plant pathways, and to understand things that we had no idea about even 5 years ago. But it is so worthwhile as an enterprise to do what we can to spread the word, to create demonstrations, to spark people, to incentivize them, and to generally make them feel that this is an enterprise that is just worth understanding and knowing.